Hi, Michelle.
Are you Anne Marie?
I'm I'm Teresa.
Lisa? Okay, because it just says City Lit. So,
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, I'm Teresa. I'm the bookstore owner.
hi, Teresa.
Good to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Oh wow, I guess I should probably. Am I light enough? Because
Doing great.
I have
Yep.
another light that I can put on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me see here. I want to make you a co-host.
Let me just put the other light on. Okay. It's all right.
Okay. Yes. So now you're a co-host, which is good. And I will make Dr. Jones a co-host when she gets on. So have you guys talked about how you want to do this in terms of, you're doing a conversation, right? No reading?
Yeah. Yeah. No reading. I mean, the only thing is that there's one paragraph that I would like to read,
Oh, cool.
which I just thought it was pretty powerful.
Yeah, yeah, great. Yeah. And then if there are questions in the chat, do you want me to read those? Do you just want to look at them and read them? How do you want to do that?
um, hmm, I don't know. What do you think would be best?
Well, just if you feel comfortable looking at the chat. So do you have your chat open right now?
Yeah.
Okay. So on the side, you'll just see questions coming in. And so if you feel like there's a time where, if they kind of come in, throughout the conversation and you see them and you want to ask, that's fine. If you want me to keep track of those and just say, Teresa, read the questions, I'm happy to do that too.
Um,
Whatever you're comfortable with.
I mean, do you know how many did people register for this?
No.
Oh,
So
so you don't know how many people might
no,
show
I
up.
don't know.
Um,
I know that she's had a few other events, so sometimes that means there's not a huge crowd, but you just never know.
yeah,
I'm
because
sure
I didn't know if there would be like, 200 messages or it might be 4,
Yeah, exactly. And I'm fine with, we can just do it on the fly too, in terms of if you just want to say, Teresa, we want to read the questions or
Yeah, why don't we do that?
taking
Because
that's either way.
if it just gets to be overwhelming, number of questions, then it might be hard for me to keep track.
Yeah.
But if it's just a few, then I can do it. I mean, some people might have some of the same questions I have, so.
Yeah.
I have a list of questions next to me, and I decided that I will ask questions that are fairly open-ended, so that Martha can answer however she wants versus me kind of steering or being real super specific. There were just a couple of things when I was reading through the book that kind of struck me as interesting, just for me personally. And I was like, really? Okay, so I'll ask those.
Yeah, those are the best. Yeah.
But I'm not going to get specific. I'm not going to get specific when it comes to names and dates and things like that. I figure, Martha can get into the specifics.
Yeah, how much detail she wants to get into. Yeah, yeah.
Mhm. Because actually, I think if people haven't read the book, to me, the most important thing is that people get a sense of what the book is about versus getting into nitty-gritty detail of names and dates and locations. And that's more like if you're going to take an exam or something.
Oh, yeah, yeah, and you want to be able to kind of tease them into wanting to read the book. You
Yeah.
know, especially if you read one very powerful thing that meant a lot to you, and then she just kind of can let people know that there's more.
Hi, Martha.
Hey, Michelle.
Hi, Martha.
Hi.
I'm Teresa.
Nice to
Meet
see
you.
Mhm. So we were just talking about the general, I guess, format, which you've done so many of these. My God, how many interviews have you done, like in the last month?
I don't know. Not
Probably
as many
40?
as I think. Um, but I've done a few. I definitely have done a few. It's been great. You know, I mean, it's been great. But I haven't done this with you. And so
Yeah, I know, but I
know
mean, I
how
know that
honored
you
I
might be getting the same questions over and over again. And
am. No, no,
um,
never,
I was just telling Teresa that I mean, I read through the book, but then there were a lot of names and dates and names of organizations and on and on. And so I was thinking, instead of getting into that, for me, in the question, getting into that level of detail, I would just ask sort of general questions, and then you in your answers can get into the detail. And then there's one paragraph that I wanted to read, which actually isn't your writing. Unfortunately, it's a quote that you incorporated, and I just found it to be really interesting, and it might encapsulate kind of, I think, sort of the Black American women's experience.
Yeah. Well, that's
So
great.
I just thought it was really, I mean, like I said, I was just kind of, you can see I have flags everywhere in this book. But this particular one, I was like, whoa. So yeah.
That's fantastic. I mean,
So we're going to talk for like 30 minutes, right, Teresa? We'll have like me talking with Martha for like 30 minutes. Is that the idea? And then,
sure. I mean,
we
have, you know, I mean, the whole thing can go an hour if we have questions. You know, you guys just go for as long as you're comfortable in that format, and you'll be able to see in the chat if the group is, you know, if there are a lot of questions. See, you know, if you stop at 7 and can take questions. If there aren't a lot of questions, I guess you both can decide if you want to keep talking or however you want to kind of go about that.
Okay. I wondered how you all felt, and I really would like your opinion, how you would feel if I did a little reading at the beginning. Do people do that? Is that interesting? I've not done that before, so this is really just me trying to experiment. Is that effective, not effective?
I kind of like it when I hear the author read their words. It personalizes it, and you know, the author gives it so much more meaning, I think, than you know when I just read a book myself. So I kind of like that.
So it won't be very long, Michelle, if that's okay. But I just thought I would read, you know, some of the autobiographical bits from the beginning. That's probably where I think I'm at if I approach anything like literary. But like I said, oh, hi, Emery. Can't hear you.
You're mute.
Sorry, I just logged on to make sure everybody got on and was here and everything was good.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
When it starts. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I might try that. It would be the first time I'm doing that, Michelle. So see, these are never exactly two things the same. And I thought, you know, honestly, you know that, you know, partly my, I don't know, my courage to try and think about about this story through my own family is very inspired by the work that you've done in these years, and that.
By me? Are you kidding?
Are you kidding? No, I'm not kidding, actually.
Wow.
Because I think that, I was trained to, leave my family and myself kind of, at the door of a book. And, but, I've had enough opportunities to hear you speak, and we've done things together. And I think that it really, you and I guess in a different way also Adele Alexander, who also has, approached this story from, in her case, the perspective of her grandmother. And so I don't do anything as elaborate or, as ambitious as you all, but I do think that it's turned out to be an important part of the journey for me. So I haven't really like read that or talked about
Oh
that.
yeah, I would love to.
So if that's okay, we
Absolutely.
could start there, and then we can go wherever we go. It'll be great.
Yeah, I think it will be interesting.
Sure. Thank you all, because
It's so appropriate that we're having this conversation on the night of the debate also.
Well, I'll be honest, I had a heart attack until I realized, of course, we're on Central Time, and so it's okay because we will be able to sign off and gather ourselves and sit down. But it does feel auspicious, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
Without romanticizing it, right? Which I don't want to do. I just think it feels auspicious. It really does. And I talked to a group of high school students this morning, and they were all, they too were really anticipating the day, and felt like we had gotten the day off to the right start by talking about this book, because they were already in their minds gearing up for the debate tonight, which I thought was a great sign that high school students were kind of really tuned in that way. But B, it just made me think, oh, right, that this is a book that is supposed to do work in the world, and tonight might be one of those nights. So we'll see.
Yeah, hopefully there's more content tonight than in the last debate.
Yeah,
I think it will be. I mean, Mike Pence is, disagree with him or not on his actual politics, he at least seems to be sort of cordial, which is actually maybe a little more dangerous. I don't know. Whenever I've seen him speak, he's always kind of has a, sort of gracious tone, and he comes across as sort of a reasonable person.
Yeah, respecting.
So I would be shocked if he suddenly becomes, just obnoxious.
Yeah. I think that's right. But
he's very condescending. I mean, you almost like get a headache listening to him, because he says things in such a reasonable way, but then you're like,
that's what people.
What did he just say?
It's disarming almost, right? Because he can say pretty heinous things with a kind of cool, collected, almost, non-confrontational kind of demeanor. But I heard that Pete Buttigieg was playing him in the rehearsals.
Pete Buttigieg is like the perfect person to go against Mike Pence, because Pete knows the Bible.
Yeah.
And so he can go toe to toe, on chapter and verse and all that kind of stuff with this Christian. I mean, he is skillful at hitting Pence where Pence tries to have it as his strength. I love it, because I've never seen any other candidate do that with Pence.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely that kind of night. We've already got our dinner plans mapped out so that we can quickly eat something and be there. So, but
Kimberly Crenshaw is having a panel tomorrow to discuss.
I saw that.
Yeah.
Somebody just sent it in my email. I don't know who, was it you? I don't know who's somebody just sent it to me, and I was like, oh, that'll be great. It looked like a great panel.
Yeah, her and Alicia Garza, and Kirsten West-Savali.
Yeah.
I can't remember. There's like 3 or 4 people that are on the conversation. That looks like that'll be really interesting.
Well, I am here for smart, informed commentary. I'm not here for the nonsense, and there's a lot of nonsense out there.
Except Cardi B.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I'm actually being honest. Cardi B is way smarter than I think people give her credit for.
Mm.
And I mean, she gave a running commentary of the presidential debacle, and she posted it. I mean, it's hilarious, and I think it's great because she touches a different audience, you know, than your CNN analyst or whatever. But Cardi B is very politically engaged. And
I've heard her commentary at
happy
least once before, but I haven't seen this most recent bit. So.
Oh my God! Yeah, you have to look it up.
Okay.
I mean, she posts like 1 minute like commentaries throughout the whole debate.
Oh wow!
And she has like 1 million. She has way. I don't even know how many followers she has.
Yeah,
So I think she serves a really good purpose.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And she's funny. I mean, have you ever? I mean, just with the way she says things, she cracks me up. And I'm like, she's just raw, you know, but she says things that make sense. Yeah. If you just kind of don't pay it, you know, don't get offended by the language or whatever.
Mm-hmm. No, not too much. Not these days. Not these days. So I think technically we seem good. I'm on a new machine, so I wanted to be sure everything was sort of got a new setup going here, but this seems to be, the sound is okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are either of you expecting people? Are you aware of people that might be coming?
I have no idea.
No idea. I don't know. Yes, I know one person who is coming.
Okay.
In addition to Anne-Marie, who's already here somewhere. So yeah, Natalie Ring sent me a note earlier to say she was going to tune in. So
good. Yeah, everything seems to be fine.
Great.
So will the people who come show up as participants, or will they not be seen by us?
So when we decide we're going to start, I will let everyone know that they will ask them to turn their video off. Everyone doesn't always do that. So, I mean, I think it's easier for you and less distracting. If people do that, we can't really control it. I'll let them know that they are muted, and we will keep them, you know, the audio off, and that they should put questions in the chat. So that's kind of how that will work in the beginning. And then I thought I would just welcome everyone, introduce both of you, and then you can go start. How does that sound?
Sounds great. Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity very much.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, pretty timely, as you said.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'm sure you all heard about the Mellon Foundation, the $250 million pledge they made for monuments, creation of monuments, and it doesn't have to. I mean, it's really cool because they're saying it doesn't have to be like physical, specific, like what you normally think of as monuments, but it can be like, I don't know, and like an exhibit, or it could be a play, or just other ways to kind of tell stories. I'm so excited because I'm like trying to push the state of Illinois. I'm sure they're annoyed with me. I'm trying to really push to have some pieces created in honor of the Illinois suffragists.
Sure.
Yeah, and so, you know, Illinois is always saying they're so broke. Oh, they're so broke. But I'm like, okay, we need to get some of this grant money.
Yeah.
You know, so.
Sure. And where are you with your Ida Wells monument?
Oh my God. This has been like, I swear, I don't know what I'll do once this thing is finished, because I literally feel like it has taken up my entire adult life getting this done.
I know.
But we've raised the money. The artist is working on it. And so now everything is up to him.
Okay.
You know, the challenge with our situation is that it took us so long to raise the money, and he just couldn't like sit around waiting for us. So he, you know, had other commissions.
I see.
So even after we raised the money, he was still had like, you know, take a number, you know, kind of approach to getting us. And so I think he was finishing up like 2 other projects.
Wow.
So, but it should be done by this time next year. I think I think I can safely say by this time next year, 12 months from now, it should be done. Hopefully less than that.
And where will it be?
Phenomenal.
You're in Chicago, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it'll be at 37th and Langley, on the land where the Ida B. Wells homes were.
Okay.
Like a
Great.
plaza area. There's like a median strip, a grassy median strip, and there's a plaza area on there. It's like a walking path. So, and it's really, I mean, it's a great location because you'll be able to see it from Cottage Grove when you're looking west, and then when you're looking east from, I can't remember that, I think it's Vincennes, you'll be able to see it when you're standing there looking east. It has like almost 4 sight lines.
So that's great.
It's really a great location. It'll be very stately, very impactful. So I can't wait for this thing to be done though. God help me. I don't know what I'll do with myself once I finish.
What a great accomplishment. Oh, wow.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, by this time next year, it'll be 13 years that
Wow.
we started.
Oh,
And,
wow.
yeah. And you know what? I mean, to put things in perspective as far as my attitude is like that Rittenhouse guy who went up to Kenosha and just, you know, with his AR-15 shooting everybody.
Protecting himself.
Yeah, they raised $500,000 for his defense in like 2 weeks. And it took us 7 years to raise the $300,000 for a monument to a woman who was about peace and justice, you know. And so to me, that says a lot, you know. To me, I'm like, where people put their money and what they value in our country, because it wasn't a secret that we were working on this project.
Yeah.
It kind of offended when I saw that they had raised that much money in that short amount of time for somebody who literally is a murderer.
Yeah.
I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Politics of monuments. I think the Mellon gift is going to be a real, not a game changer, but is going to give us a new kind of focus. And I really hope so. It's really.
Oh yeah. I mean, so many people I know are so excited about that, and, you know, the prospect of what can be done with it and everything. So it will, I think, make a really big impact.
So, would you like to get started? Are there people that you think might still be coming that we should wait for?
There might be, but maybe we should get started. 'Cause
Okay.
I'm eager to talk with folks and talk with Michelle. So we're talking informally about we
Sure.
get started. So thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to City Let's virtual event with Dr. Martha Jones, author of Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All, in conversation with Michelle Duster. So right now, if you'd like to turn off your videos, might make it easier to concentrate on the speakers. You are muted. Please go to the bottom of your screen and turn on your chat. And in the chat, you can place comments and questions that Martha will get to later. And let me see if there's anything. I think that's all I need to tell you for now. So Dr. Jones is a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the story of American democracy. She's a professor at Johns Hopkins University and author of Vanguard, and also Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America, and All Bound Up Together, The Woman Question in African American Public Culture, 1830 to 1900. She was featured in the new PBS documentary, American Experience, The Vote. Michelle Duster is an author, professor, public historian, and champion of racial and gender equity. In the last dozen years, she has written, edited, or contributed to 12 books. She co-wrote the popular children's history book Tate and His Historic Dream, and edited 2 books that include the writings of her paternal great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells. Her advocacy has led to street names, monuments, historical markers, and other public history projects that highlight women and African Americans, including Ida B. Wells. She has 2 children's picture books that will be published in 2022. Please join me. We are so thrilled to welcome you here tonight for the conversation with Martha and Michelle. Thank you.
Thanks so
you.
much. Michelle, I don't know if you want to go first.
So Martha, we were thinking, we were thinking that it would make the most impact for you to, well, first, before you read a section, I just wanted to start with asking what made you decide to write this book? So if you could talk about like kind of where the idea came from and what was your motivation. And I think that will probably segue into you reading like an excerpt of the book.
Yeah, thank you. So thanks to City Lit and thanks to you, Michelle. You and I have been part of a series of conversations around what has now been almost a year of events and celebrations and more marking the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And I was somebody who a few years back, when I began to anticipate the anniversary, really worried that African American women might not, as we might say, get their due in this anniversary year. There were signs. In particular, we were talking informally before about monuments. There was a proposed monument for New York's Central Park that would honor early suffragists and included Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and relegated everyone else to a scroll that kind of flowed from the feet of Stanton and Anthony. And while that monument has been revised and now includes Sojourner Truth, it was a kind of sign that we needed to really attend to the way in which this anniversary would roll out. And Vanguard, I'm somebody who writes books and articles, so I don't design monuments, but Vanguard was my way of hoping to contribute to shaping the year that we've had. So it's the fastest book I've ever written by a long shot, because I didn't have a whole lot of time if I wanted it to be in print this year. But I wanted to have the sort of book that interested and curious readers could come to as an introduction to African American women's political history. Not the last book you should read, maybe not even the first, but one that is, I hope, a good introduction to the broad swath of the field, with a focus on the vote.
So you started your book with kind of like your personal journey to this material. And so can you talk about that and read an excerpt of that introduction?
Yeah, and for folks who weren't tuned in a little earlier while we were talking informally, I said to Michelle, that she is one of the people who really inspired me to take seriously the impulse that I needed to know more about the women in my family, along with many, many other women who grace the pages of this book. And I realized I didn't know their stories. Those weren't the kind of stories that had been passed down in my family. So if it's okay, I'm just going to read a little bit, and folks can get a flavor for what I found. I started writing Vanguard by collecting stories of the women in my own family. These began as far back as I can trace with Nancy Bell Graves, who was born enslaved in 1808 in Danville, Kentucky. I wondered what it had been like for Nancy's daughters and granddaughters when in 1920, the 19th Amendment opened a door to women's votes. That year, 3 generations of women in my family, from my grandmother to her mother's mother, faced the same question. Could they vote? And if so, what would they do with their ballots? And though I knew a lot of family tales, I'd never heard any about how we fit into the story of American women's rise to power. I knew that Black women had won the vote unevenly in a struggle that took more than a century. They'd fought for their rights, hoping to change the lives of all Black Americans. They confronted an ugly mix of racism and sexism that stunted their aspirations. And still, I knew that I came from women who had always found a way to gather their strength and then promote the well-being of their community, the nation, and the world. My great-great-grandmother, Susan Davis, was Nancy's oldest daughter. And when she said that she wanted to vote, it was a radical idea. She had been born enslaved in 1840, 20 years before the Civil War. Susan was a young woman when slavery was abolished in 1865. Her husband, Sam, had fought for the Union and against slavery as a private in the 114th U.S. Colored Infantry. And Sam's valor gave him a claim to political rights. Susan celebrated when, with the adoption of the 15th Amendment, he won the ballot in 1870, but disappointment soon followed when local laws such as poll taxes, along with intimidation and violence, kept her Sam from the ballot box. Susan learned a critical lesson in those years about the vote. Black Americans had to build other routes to political power. Racism kept Black Kentuckians to the sidelines on election day, but Susan got busy. She banded together with friends and neighbors to form a Black women's club that linked them to thousands of women across the country in a movement that would use political power to ensure the dignity of all humanity. When the 19th Amendment was adopted in 1920, Susan knew that it was a new chance for her and the women like her. I can't say precisely what she did in that moment, though I'd like to think that she steered her buggy from home on the edge of Danville to the voting precinct office. White commentators in Kentucky certainly worried that she would do just that. Black women, they feared, might outnumber white women at the polls and tip the balance in favor of the Republican Party. Likely Susan didn't worry about that very much. The potential for an upset would have been just what she had in mind. Susan's daughter Fanny was settled in St. Louis, Missouri by 1920 when the 19th Amendment became law. Susan had given Fanny every advantage she could manage. Above all else, that meant an education. As a teen, Fanny had left her mother's home in Danville and spent a prep year at Western Pennsylvania's Allegheny College. Then she enrolled in the classic course at Berea College, a place that taught Kentucky's poor, Black and white. Fanny received her bachelor's degree in 1888 and married her Berea schoolmate, Frank Williams, 3 years later. They began teaching careers, raised 4 children in Covington, Kentucky, before settling in Missouri's largest city. Frank rose to prominence as head of St. Louis Fable's Sumner High School. When it came to politics, Fanny borrowed a page from her mother's book. While barred from voting, she built power where she could. She proved to be a talented organizer and fundraiser and spearheaded construction of the first Black YWCA in St. Louis, named for the enslaved 18th century poet Phillis Wheatley. In these rooms, Black women had a toehold in Fanny's city, a base from which they built skills and influence. In 1919, Missouri became the 11th state to approve the 19th Amendment, but it would take the approval of 15 more states to make it law. In the meantime, there was work to do. Fanny spent the months before the 19th Amendment was adopted preparing the city's Black women for the literacy and understanding tests that officials would use to keep them from joining voters' rolls. When Election Day 1920 came around, Fanny knew what was at stake. Perhaps she even cast a ballot. If so, she would have taken special care in dressing for the occasion, putting on a tailored dress, modest pumps, the right piece of jewelry, and a smart hat. The day of the first vote felt as special as any wedding, graduation, or public ceremony. There's one more story about Fanny, and I'll end with this. that really was formative for me in this book, where I continued to encounter Black women recounting stories of violence, that not only was their work or their ideas political, they were provocative enough that woman after woman everyone had a story to tell about that moment when a white man put his hands on her. So one more story about Fannie Williams, my great-grandmother, and this one remained untold in my family as well. I discovered it among some old news clippings. Fannie had completed her studies at Berea College in 1888, nothing short of a triumph. During commencement, President Edward Henry Fairchild remarked at Fannie, "In all of my experience of teaching for 38 years, I've never had a better student than you. Remember, you are admitted to the circle of all those who have attained the title of the Bachelor of Arts." Fannie had acquired a taste for entertainment, or at least it seemed so, and in 1889, she set off in a January evening to the local theater in Pulaski, Kentucky, just south of Berea. The schedule included what was called a free Indian show, an evening of lectures on the history, culture, and medicines of Native Americans. Admission was free. The company earned its dollars selling ointments, pills, and other remedies. Fannie entered the hall without trouble. She surveyed the room and spied a seat that was to her liking. Perhaps she was feeling a sense of equality that her recent triumph at Berea had fueled. Maybe her mood was contrary, leading her to challenge the rules that told her she was less than. Fannie crossed the theater, approached a row designated for white patrons only, and quietly took a seat. I can imagine her there as she smoothed her skirt, placed down her purse, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. Even before segregation became baked into the laws of Kentucky, theater operators patrolled the color line, on alert for those who might cross it. First, an usher noticed Fannie. He approached her, and as Fannie explained, went to her in a gruff manner and ordered her to move. Immediately, a contest of wills flared. Fannie, with her sense of dignity and entitlement on the one hand, and the usher on the other, adamant that a Black woman, even a respectable one, must be put in her place. Fannie ignored him and remained firmly seated with her back erect and her eyes fixed straight ahead until a local marshal arrived. He repeated the usher's admonition, and Fannie retorted. She asked him politely to tell her why she was not allowed to sit where she was, as she did not think she was harming anyone by sitting there. Her words were both a query and a challenge. Now, what happened next might lead you to think that Fannie had studied law rather than classics at Berea. The marshal repeated his order. She was to move across the aisle to the colored section. Why was she being ordered to move? By what authority? By whose power? Papers later reported that Fannie denounced the marshal in strong terms, though she never devolved into the use of indecent or profane language. A confrontation of words turned physical when the marshal, fed up with Fannie's challenge to his authority, caught her roughly by the arm and led her to the door. I'll stop there, but I think it's that moment when he puts his hand on her and leads her to the door that I'll never forget, because it is the sort of story that nearly all Black suffragists have to tell about that moment in a theater, on a streetcar, on a railroad car. There is someone who not only deems them out of place, who is willing to use raw brute force in order to invoke the color line vividly. What no one would have ever said about my great-grandmother is that she would talk back, or that she would fight back, that she would resist in any way. And yet she did. And I'm always left with the question about why that story didn't survive, why it got submerged. But I feel really fortunate that writing Vanguard gave me the chance to track it down and to retell it. So thanks for letting me start with that.
Oh, I mean, thanks for sharing that, because, you know, I think that's kind of what makes history, just in my opinion, that's what makes history personal. You know, I mean, if with this specific topic of suffrage, for anybody any woman, but anybody, but who is living today, whose family goes back in this country 3 generations, well, anybody our age, who has family going back 3 generations, has family members who did not have the right to vote before 1920. And so, or most, I mean, there were a couple of states that gave women the right to vote before then, but the great majority, of us are related to people who did not have that right. And so it's almost like the personal history is the nation's history. And so I think these personal stories are important because it makes it real. It's not just some abstract kind of concept of like women didn't have the right to vote. It's like, no, my great grandmother didn't have the right to vote. And for a lot of us, it was probably our great grandmothers. So that's not ancient history. And it's like we're related to people that we might be able to have these family stories passed down, or at least have access to some of the information that really does make it kind of hits you that it's not that. I mean, we're only the 2nd generation of women after the ones who originally got the right to vote. So I mean, I think I love to kind of put that into perspective for people, because I think some people look at history as like boring, dry. Oh my God, it's a bunch of names and dates and places. It's like, no, this is your family. If your family members were here and they were alive, they were dealing with this.
Well, I've been working with a group of students this semester, and one of the first assignments I gave them was to interview an elder in their circle about the vote, and they came back wide-eyed, because I think it's, as you say, it wasn't ancient history, and frankly, among my students, there was one who then told her own story of voter suppression in 2018, because now young people who are our students are heading to the polls for the very first time under conditions that tragically parallel the experiences to an important degree that our great-grandmothers confronted in 1920. And so it turns out that they are also able to put those stories on the table about how some of them didn't get to cast ballots, for example, in Georgia in 2018. Despite coming out to the polls. So it is definitely history that lives in this moment.
Right, and I think what makes it sort of live is racial oppression, differences along racial lines, and in some situations maybe class. And so can you just give a sort of brief summary of what you've found to be the major differences in the experiences of white women who were fighting for the right to vote versus the experiences of Black women who were fighting the right to vote before 1920?
Sure. There's no question but that really since the 1860s, anti-Black racism, sometimes in the hearts and minds of suffragists, other times as a strategy for furthering the cause of women's votes, meant that I think suffrage associations, white-led suffrage associations, were always awkward and ill-fitting homes for Black women's politics. And so it's no mistake that we find Black women doing the work of suffrage and fighting for their political rights, but they're doing it through organizations, including their churches, including the National Association of Colored Women. But as important, I think, African American women are never and are resolutely not single issue activists. And of course, the so important, the work of Ida Wells and the many other Black women who are challenging lynching as a necessary companion to voting rights. And I think before I wrote this book, I didn't fully discern the connection, which is to say, yes, you could win a federal amendment that would look to guarantee to women the right to vote. But if intimidation and violence and lynching persist, that's a hollow vote. And Black women know that, of course, because they've watched African-American men be disenfranchised by law, but also by violence. And so I understand, I think, better than I ever have, how those two things are inextricable in the political lives of Black women. And that doesn't make them less committed to women's votes. It just means that they have a much more fraught political terrain to navigate simultaneously as they work on political power. You know, for me, Black women are the original anti-racist feminists, right? They are the intersectional visionaries who, from the early 19th century, are decrying the problem of race and the problem of sex simultaneously out of their own experiences. And when I introduce my students to that, my students think, you know, intersectionality is a 21st century idea. They think they invented it, in fact. So there's a lot there to teach about the origins of this idea. But importantly, one lesson is about the ways in which, going all the way back to the 1820s, Black women are speaking and claiming in intersectional terms. And they do that for a long time alone. That's part of the difference, right? Is that they are not joined in important numbers or in an organized way by white women in that, in trying to realize that vision. It is a lonely business to be an anti-racist feminist in early America. It's a lonely business in the 20th century. But Black women stay true to that vision, even as it takes them a long time to win robust allies in that view. Those are some of the differences, I think.
One of the things that kind of struck me of the early, the early women, like in the 1820s, who were mostly involved in preaching, which I found to be interesting, that a lot of the I guess, I don't know if they would be considered, I guess you would consider them suffragists, but it was more like just pushing for women to have, be included in leadership positions. Mm-hmm. And I hate to bring this up, but it did strike me that several of the women who were leaders, who became leaders within the preaching or religious sort of leadership roles were widows. Mm. And I mean, as I kept reading, and I was like, and another woman's husband died, and then her husband died, and so I honestly started thinking, were they poisoning these men? Like, what happened? Why did all the men die?
Oh, but I mean, so shy of poisoning, I think that you know, shy of a deliberate act, it tells us something, right, about the tight constraints, right, that in the early 19th century, women who aspire to public leadership, women who are speaking forthrightly through a critique that decries sexism and racism, in many ways find themselves to the margins, which is to say, if you're not meeting the, you know, the criticism of your husband or your minister, you're like Mariah Stewart in Boston, you know, being basically ridiculed and drummed out of public life. And so it's important to say the stakes are high. And it's true that marriage gives some of the women in this book a kind of important claim to a kind of respectability, right? Just the gesture of terming oneself, right, Mrs. Mariah Stewart, is part of the ways in which Black women are constructing their public persona, but it is also true. Jarena Lee, who's the early American preacher, really, as she tells it in her memoir, for all the years of her marriage, she's sick. And we don't know if she's sick in the heart, or she's sick in the body, or she's ill in the mind, but she's very troubled, and marriage does not suit her. And when her husband dies, this is her opportunity to not only return to Philadelphia, where she's a part of an important African Methodist Episcopal congregation, but she is loosened in some way, right, from some of the bounds. And so I don't think it's a mistake. Well, I don't think it's a conspiracy quite. I don't think.
I was just joking.
And then there are other examples later on, right, of women who have very compatible, right, companionate marriages, right, with men who are partners. This is true for Mary Church Terrell, for example. Robert Terrell is her biggest supporter and her confidant, and much more. He lives a short life, but I think everything about their marriage says that she waited to get married until there was a man who could match her intellectually and more, but also who could imagine a family life and much more that included her as an activist. So these are women who are absolutely navigating that. Terrell takes her daughter Phyllis many places. It's sort of a thrilling, to read. It's sort of thrilling to imagine, to be the daughter of someone like Terrell, and to be traveling, to be picketing the White House with your mother. It's remarkable. But in her memoir, right, Terrell is much more forthcoming about how difficult that is to manage.
So that leads me to, Mary Church Terrell is a big part of your book when you're talking about that time period of like the 1890s or so. And so I was just kind of struck by how not only were Black women having to contend with racism, anti-Black racism within, from most white women. Obviously there were some allies, but I think the lesser told story is the lack of uniformity among Black people. So can you talk about like what happened within the Black community? Because there were differing ideas about what suffrage meant, and if women should actually get the right to vote. And yeah, so that was interesting.
There's no question but that I think everyone, behind closed doors in those years would acknowledge that this is a risky proposition for African American women to step out onto the political stage, to associate them with a profoundly controversial cause like suffrage. Black women have already been subject to ridicule, barbs, and more. It's a dangerous business to be even a reserved, church activist in these years. So there is, I think, an important caution that attends the work of an organization like the National Association of Colored Women as it considers its position on suffrage. And Terrell is among the women who has to lead that organization to suffrage gradually. And even when Black women agree about the, if you will, the desirability of winning political rights, there's a lot of disagreement about how to get there. And here, Margaret Murray Washington is someone, for example, who is adamant that Black women should not be associating with the National American Women's Suffrage Association, later the National Women's Party, especially not with radical suffragists who I think in Washington's view, threatened to, if you will, drag Black women into the mud with them, Black women who are far more vulnerable, who have more to lose, I think, in Washington's view. And so we see the ways in which Washington will say, I'm not going to work for suffrage, and I'm not going to encourage the women in my organization to do that either. We'll prepare ourselves so that when the vote comes, we're ready to vote, right? So she's not indifferent wholly, but she's not someone who is going to encourage Black women to attend the 1913 march or parade in Washington. She's not going to encourage Black women to picket the White House. That she thinks is work that should be left to white women, if it's to be done at all. There are important debates and disagreements that, read W.E.B. Du Bois's The Crisis in these years, and you will find Black Americans across a remarkable spectrum when it comes to women's votes. But it's also true that by 1911, 1912, 1913, Black women are beginning to vote and are beginning to push back against the kind of stereotypes, which is that somehow they won't use the vote or they won't know how to use the vote. They're really pushing back against that. And their political work is the best evidence for what women's suffrage can actually mean for Black communities.
So that brings me to, okay, so you have this sort of differing ideas within the Black community about how to go about fighting for the right to vote. But then also as much as some people don't want to acknowledge this, there are class differences within the Black community. And so can you talk about that as far as, like, one of the things I noticed is that most of the women that you highlighted were college educated.
Yes.
And a lot of them were teachers, which I know was one of the few professions that, educated Black women could actually do. So where do you think the role of class, fit in when it came to women that were involved in the suffrage movement and being leaders in this area?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think if I could, there's sort of two ways to answer that question. One is an acknowledgement of the choices that I made as a writer, as a researcher, as a historian in deciding how to tell the story of Black women and the vote. I could have endeavored, right, to tell a story from the perspective of working women rather than many, many leading women. And there are some women in Vanguard who are not household names, but certainly women who are household names are here and play outsized roles. And so the confession, if you will, from me as the historian is that I'm writing a book that is very much intended to push back against the kind of the ongoing construction of a white women's pantheon of suffragists. And I want to offer up to us names and stories and long lives of activism. And that leads me in a way to tell a certain kind of story. I wanted to write about women who you could read more about, that I wanted the footnotes to do that kind of work, which is to say, if you're taken with Mary Church Terrell or Mary McLeod Bethune, you can read my footnotes, you can Google, you can read more about them. I wanted this in a way to be a primer. So that's one way to answer that I made a set of choices that mean that leading women, college educated women and more are attempt to stand in for the whole. And at the same time, I think there is a tension, right, within this movement. The NACW is, by World War I, 300,000 women strong, which means that it is a diverse movement, that there are not 300,000 Black women teachers and college educated women. at the advent of the First World War. But the politics, the writing, the newsletters are dominated by women who are, as the motto goes, right, lifting as they climb. And so the NADCW is premised to an important degree in the view that there are women who are best positioned to lead, best positioned to show the way forward. Choose the metaphor you like. Mary Church Terrell is many things, but retiring about her sense of personal superiority, she is not, right? Terrell believes in her class, in her education, in her political connections, and much more, and how that situates her, not uniquely, but distinctly, as contrasted with working women. Now, I was very excited to follow very much behind historian Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham in her work on Nannie Helen Burroughs. And Burroughs helps us to glimpse in her leadership of Black Baptist women, who are not 300,000 or 3 million. We understand, right, that working women, that those are histories to be written. Those are important histories to be written, because Burroughs not only represents this extraordinary swath of Black womanhood in suffrage circles and more, she is among the figures who will be the voice of working women, the voice of women who are certainly not college educated, who have modest educations, who are domestic laborers and more. And so Burroughs is there, but she's one part of the story, and hardly I'm not able to touch the 3 million women that she represents. And Burroughs, I think, does her own job of navigating that world. But there's something about leadership, right, that is a challenge for even Burroughs when it comes to how do you bring other women along with you into leadership circles. So it's an important question, and it's one that we will continue to work on. There are many divisions between Black women and among Black women that are in this book that I'm only gesturing at as I sort of try to keep the thread of voting rights activism at the center, because of course there are Black radical women who we glimpse in this story, Black women who step away from politics as conventional as suffrage politics to join the Garvey movement, for example. That is another important thread in the story of Black women's politics. It's one I can only gesture at in this book.
Yeah, I mean, I think
happy to recommend other books to be read on the.
I think it's important for people to understand that the Black community is not a monolith. Because I mean, I don't know about you, but for me, it bothers me even today when we hear, like when we're not right now in the middle of a political campaign, right? And so there's all these analysts that are like, oh, well, the white suburban women are polling at this, and oh, the urban, professional women are doing this and this and that, and they dissect the white community, and then they say, and then the Black vote, and I'm like, why is the Black vote just one blanket statement? But it's okay for, you have the rural, communities and all these, God knows, like 20 different ways that they're slicing and dicing white communities, but we don't have the luxury of being considered, diverse. And so I think it's important, what you've done to kind of, touch on the fact that there is not a monolith within the Black community. There are divisions, there are controversy, there are differing opinions about things, and so there is a question in the chat of what stands out to both of us this centennial when we reflect on the place and memory of Black women's involvement in the suffrage movement.
I'd love to know your answer to that. I have an answer, but
what stands out to me,
yeah.
When I reflect on the place and memory, I guess the first thing that comes to my mind is that I feel that Black women have had to fight and push in order to make sure that Black women who were involved in the suffrage movement are recognized and celebrated. I don't think that with Black women pushing and speaking up, and Martha, you were amazing in some of the articles that you wrote, and in some of the comments that you were making about some of these tributes being, I mean, just this sort of oops, we forgot, kind of responses. And it's like, unless we are the ones that are saying hello, can you expand your vision a little bit, then I think we would still be left out.
Yeah. I don't disagree. And at the same time, I have seen other projects that really have evolved. I've been in the hardest conversations of my professional life have been around the suffrage anniversary. I have spoken to more people, colleagues, and more people who with whom I disagree about this anniversary, what it means, how we should mark it, and more. And I've been admiring of myself, frankly, but I've been admiring of women across a broad spectrum who have come to the table to talk through the history, the politics, and the meaning of this anniversary for the future. I think along the way, we have changed some minds and we have broadened some thinking. And that's not raw politics. That's in part because we bring to the table rich histories. I mean, in other words, we're not just polemical, saying, more Black women. We're saying, here you go, right? Here you go. Let me teach you something. So we're both educators. And I think that's been an advantage in this year is I put on my teacher's hat. And even when someone appears shut down or uninterested, well, that happens in my classroom from time to time. I can admit that to you all. And so I have a way, right, of hanging in there with folks. And so I do think that our willingness, not just to bring our point of view, but to bring our work to the table, right? Whether it's in an exhibition, you and I were together around the National Portrait Gallery exhibition curated by Kate LeMay, working with Kate, not only to, critique her or to challenge her, but to say, here, right? Here's a portrait, literally, here's a set of ideas, here's a way to frame this, that I think we worked together on this and that we had a great deal to offer that my sense was many people just didn't feel like they had command of. I wrote this book in large part, frankly, for journalists. I was meeting journalists who just knew nothing. And it wasn't because they didn't want to know, right? How many people have you met who say to you, how come nobody taught me this in school? Well, the truth is nobody taught me this in school either. So I had to learn it. And I thought, well, here we are as a community of Black women's historians. We really have something to offer the country as it figures out what to do with this anniversary. So yes, there are dust-ups for sure, and there are difficult moments. History has come back into the crosshairs of politics in a very tough way. But I also think that folks have learned something in this year, and that for me is a lot. It's not everything, but it's a lot, more than I expected 3 years ago when I was sort of looking ahead and concerned that there would be no room for the kind of histories that we write.
Yeah, so in this book, you didn't stop at 1920. Mm-hmm. You actually went all the way pretty much to right now. And so how do you see sort of the arc of this struggle from 1820 to 2020?
Absolutely. Oof. All credit to my grandmother, who gave an interview in 1978 that I found when I was looking at my family history. And she didn't talk about 1920 at all, though she was living and could have certainly been engaged in suffrage politics. She talked about the 50s and 60s, right? And that was a kind of affirmation, right, that this book had to come at least till 1965 and the Voting Rights Act, because for her that was the pinnacle of the struggle for Black women's votes, rather than 1920. The arc, in a sense, is about begins as a story about Black women's ideas. And how Black women think their way through the problem of American politics in the 19th century, how they begin to define a set of political ideals, that anti-racist feminist view, as we would call it today, and how they struggle at landmark moments, 1870 and the 15th Amendment, 1920 and the 19th Amendment, and finally 1965, all of which I think are part of a whole for Black women when it comes to voting rights. So I think of this book as chapters, maybe more so than an arc in that broad sense. But I had to come all the way to 2020 because the Black women of 2020 are really the best evidence for why this book is, if you will, essential reading. I'll just say it. And what I mean by that is that I end with Leader Stacey Abrams. And Leader Abrams, when queried about how it is that she comes into American politics, it is through the force of her own family, it is her education, but it is her understanding of Black women's history and Black women historical figures who are her inspiration, who are her role models, and more. And she invokes a Sojourner Truth and a Harriet Tubman, even in 2020, as essential. The other night, not so long ago in August, Kamala Harris accepted the Democratic nomination. Is going to run for vice president. She name-checked 6 women: Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, Mary McLeod Bethune, Diane Nash, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Constance Baker Motley. She did not invoke Alice Paul or Carrie Chapman Catt. She did not invoke Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Susan Anthony. And if you as an American want to understand Kamala Harris and how she comes to be who she is and where she is, if you want to understand the tradition out of which she comes, you need to know those 6 women and more, because that's the answer to a critical part of the political puzzle in 2020. So I come all the way forward because it turned out every time I scratched the surface of Black women who are on the scene today, they all had a history lesson in them, and it was about the women in Vanguard.
Wow. Okay, so we only have, I guess, a few minutes technically left. And so there's a question in the chat. It says, yes, and do you feel this anniversary also featuring an African-American woman as the face of the future politics in the VP? So this follows up with what you were just saying.
Yeah.
Do you view that as a watershed? Is it possible, is a possible time where voices of women of color can finally be heard by this country? And it just so happens that the vice presidential debate is in about, what, an hour or so. So we will actually be able to see Kamala Harris in action on the national stage. That, like you said, she acknowledges she's standing on shoulders.
Yeah, absolutely. As we think about sort of recent history, for me, 2008 was really a turning point. That was a contest that featured Secretary Hillary Clinton, then Senator Clinton, and Barack Obama. But for folks like us, you know, I was really tuned into the Black women who were seizing that moment and really carving out new space for themselves, using their voices very effectively. And they were a very diverse group of women. There's Mrs. Obama, right, who you know, steps to the stage at the Democratic Convention in 2008 to talk about her own history, about the political history out of which she comes. And we know, right, how that was a sort of inaugural moment for her and the force that she has become in American politics, despite the fact that she's never going to run for public office. Her work around getting out the vote, her support for Joe Biden, distinguishes her as a figure of consequence. 2008 gave us Donna Brazile, who came out from the back rooms of the Democratic Party and on to in front of the cameras on CNN, and was a major interpreter of the politics of 2008. And she did so very forthrightly from the perspective of her position as a Black woman. Oprah Winfrey came out of the television studio and hit the trail with Barack Obama. And Winfrey's speeches in 2008 are fascinating because she too offers up a very forthright interpretation of who Black women are in 2008, how they are going to be of consequence. Now, I was someone who in 2008, this will date me, so bear with me, but there was something called the blogosphere in 2008, and Black women were very active in the blogosphere. It was a major place to be for the exchange of ideas, for the development of ideas, and Black women weighed in and chewed on that political contest on the blogs. And when you read those blogs, you have the distinct, right, palpable sense of how Black women are arrived at American politics as analysts, as activists, as critics, and more. But it is a cacophony of voices in 2008 in the blogosphere. So for me, that really is the turning point that helps me understand how it is that when we get to 2020 and the Democratic Party signals its readiness, right, to seat a Black woman, right, seat a woman and likely a woman of color and perhaps a Black woman, right, on the ticket, there's not one Black woman who is a forceful candidate. There are 6 Black women in that pool. And that is a reminder that there's no tokenism. The time of tokenism is over. The time of Black women firsts is behind us, that Black women have become a force in politics. Somewhere between 120 and 130 Black women running for Congress alongside Kamala Harris on our ballots. And maybe some of you have already seen them because you've already cast your ballots. That is a force in American politics and no longer simply shattering barriers. And that is, to me, the framing in the context for Kamala Harris. You know, that's American politics. We love the top of the ticket. You know, we love the presidential contest. But those 120, 130 Black women running for Congress, that's a game changer in Congress come January, even as all of them are not likely to be seated. That's a game changer in Washington. And I am one really ready. I'm here to see how that changes the debate in Washington. I'm excited for that.
So last question that I have to ask you, which people ask me all the time, is what would your great-grandmother think about what's going on today?
Well, my goodness. In some ways, wouldn't it be all too familiar to her, right? Which is to say, the rancor, the vitriol, the voter suppression, the anti-Black racism, all of that, I think, would be to her tragically familiar. And at the same time, there's no question for me that one of the lessons that comes partly out of the life of my great-grandmother, your great-grandmother, and more, but many, right, thousands and thousands of women of their generation in this country, is we've got to roll up our sleeves, right, and do the groundwork that politics demands in this country and get ourselves to the polls and cast our ballots. We've got to set the bar high and always aim for our best ideals, even as they seem far off and difficult to attain. And what your question really underscores is that for the women of Vanguard, this is a project of generations, right? My great-grandmother, your great-grandmother, they don't live to see the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but that's not the measure of their politics, right? They are there grooming, teaching, promoting, and making sure that next generations of Black women are there to see through the work that they began. Politics in this country is a long game, and while there are things I too will never live to see, I know that what my grandmother would say is get to work, right? It is time to do the work. It is urgent, it is now, and you've got to work on all those levels in American politics if you have a shot at changing the game. And we know that they were game changers in their own lifetimes. And somebody, I don't know if you know Dr. Noelle Trent, who runs the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, but I spoke with her a few nights ago, and she asked me a question that I loved and that I think is really poignant. What kind of ancestor will you be? Right? So that's where we are in 2020, right? We know what kind of ancestors our grandmothers, our great-grandmothers, our mothers and more were. We know the kind of women that they were. What kind of ancestors will we be when our daughters and our granddaughters and our nieces and our great nieces and more look back? That is the test, I think, of this moment. And they passed that test pretty well. I can only hope, right, that folks will look back on us and say that we did our work when it was time to do our work.
Yeah, wow. Well, that's a great way to end this conversation, this very fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for doing this with me, and thanks to City Lit for giving us a warm up to the main act, which I take this evening is happening shortly on our televisions when we will watch Kamala Harris debate Vice President Pence.
Yeah, it's perfect for that. Thank you so much. It was just a wonderful talk. I think you probably could go on forever. I mean, I could go on listening, that's for sure. But thank you so much to both of you. Thanks everyone for attending. You can go to citylitbooks.com to get the book. And thanks very much. Have a good night watching the debate.
Be safe, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.